Back when I was in film school, one of my professors gave me an article he had published that was about the significance of what he called the 5 cyber films of 1995. 5 big-budget, high-concept Hollywood movies that dealt with the emergence of the internet age. Since I have the memory of a goldfish, I can't really remember what his thesis was, but I do remember that the article was about how pop culture deals with new technology and how the cyberpunk genre in particular was being used to explore the possibilities and pitfalls waiting for us on what we used to call the information superhighway. Since 1995 is now 30 years behind us, I thought I should revisit the topic and talk about these 5 cyber films. They might look antiquated and even a little ridiculous now, but back then, they were on the cutting edge of sci-fi cinema, and today, they are more relevant than you might expect.
The year is 2021, and mankind is suffering an epidemic. People are falling victim to a terminal disease known as NAS, and the warring megacorporations that now rule the world are too invested in their own secrets to do anything about it. That's where Johnny comes in. A digital courier, Johnny has sacrificed his own memories in order to store industrial secrets in his head. And he's got one last job to do before he can retire and reclaim his past. Stuffed with more data than he can physically handle, and with that data being a potential key to curing NAS, his job is interrupted by Yakuza foot soldiers, and now his own brain has become a ticking time bomb. Can he get the information out of his head in time, or will he lose himself to digital oblivion?
For the uninitiated, cyberpunk refers to a subgenre of science fiction that takes a lot of cues from pulp detective noir stories like classic Dashiell Hammett novels and the punk movement of the late 60s and early 70s. But instead of dealing with murder mysteries or modern sociopolitics, cyberpunk focuses on heady issues of digital consciousness, instant global telecommunication, dystopian futures, and transhumanism, which is the notion that, with cybernetics and brain alterations, we could be fast approaching a time where we are no longer strictly human. Now, with that admittedly superficial definition out of the way, you can't have a conversation about cyberpunk without talking about William Gibson. While cyberpunk did technically exist in a primordial form before Gibson, it's fair to credit the novelist with pioneering the genre and bringing it to mainstream attention, alongside Ridley Scott's seminal Blade Runner, released while Gibson was in the middle of writing his debut novel, Neuromancer. Prior to that, Gibson had written several short stories set in a cyberpunk future, most notably Johnny Mnemonic, published by Omni magazine in May of 1981, in which he developed his idiosyncratic style, interconnected universe, and extensive lingo, all of which would become as common to the genre as Tolkien's archetypes are to fantasy. Neuromancer would go on to be the first novel to ever earn a science fiction Triple Crown, meaning it won a Nebula, a Hugo, and a Philip K. Dick Award. It's hard to overstate just how much of an impact it had on the science fiction literary scene, and it didn't take long for Hollywood to take notice. Almost immediately, the studios were competing for the rights, and a potential film adaptation has been in various stages of development practically since the day the novel was published, though it looks as though a streaming series is going to be the first one to actually make it to the finish line. Enter New York artist Robert Longo, who had always had an interest in film. He directed a short film, a few music videos, and even an episode of Tales from the Crypt, and he wanted to turn Neuromancer into a modestly budgeted black and white art film, something along the lines of Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville, itself an early French New Wave prototype for cyberpunk. Longo became friends with Gibson in 1989, and rather than Neuromancer, they decided to adapt the story Johnny Mnemonic, which they felt was more manageable. Although the project did get early approval from Warner Brothers, studio shakeups forced Longo and Gibson to shop it around elsewhere. They discovered then that nobody was really interested in making an artsy $2 million science fiction film from a first-time feature director. Then came Total Recall, and the calculations changed. Hollywood scrambled to find more high-concept sci-fi stories they could turn into ostentatious action movies, and TriStar Pictures, in conjunction with a few international distributors, agreed to finance Johnny Mnemonic on the condition that they make it for over $20 million and ditch Longo's more art house aspirations. Ultimately, seeing no other way of getting the movie made, Longo and Gibson agreed, and Johnny Mnemonic was underway by mid-February 1994. The title role of Johnny was originally given to Val Kilmer, who left the project to play Batman. So instead, the role went to Keanu Reeves, known at the time mostly for Point Break and the Bill and Ted movies. Rumor has it the script was literally left on Reeves' doorstep, but this is probably just a Hollywood myth. Reeves and Longo got along well, and Longo felt that Reeves understood the role and understood what the director was trying to do with the movie. Reeves' best scene, the now famous room service tirade, was inserted at the last minute to give Johnny a bit more personality and to give Reeves a chance to be more animated.
I want room service!
The female lead, meanwhile, is played by Dina Meyer in her big screen debut as Jane. In the original story, her character is the ubiquitous Molly Millions, but due to the fact that the character also appears in Neuromancer and that the rights were with another studio at the time, they changed her to somebody else. Although Jane's similarities to the cyberpunk femme fatale icon are obvious to anybody who's read enough of Gibson's early work. Second billing, though, went to Dolph Lundgren, who plays a character entirely invented for the movie and originally intended for U2's Bono.
Jesus time.
Lundgren was cast by the studio for his international appeal and action movie credentials. Robert Longo was at first hesitant about the actor, though he quickly warmed up to him and let him loose to play the unhinged street preacher in the most deliciously over-the-top way imaginable. As much as I like Lundgren and think the character has potential, you can tell he was tacked on, as he seems to serve little narrative purpose. It doesn't help that his best scene, in which he nakedly delivers a twisted religious sermon on transhumanism, was cut for Western audiences. Other actors worth noting are Japanese superstar Takeshi Kitano as the Yakuza boss Takahashi, Ice-T as the leader of the Low-Techs J-Bone,
I'm J-Bone. I run heaven.
hardcore legend Henry Rollins as Spider, German character actor Udo Kier as Ralphie, and the director's wife, Barbara Sokoa, as Anna. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that nobody gives a particularly good acting performance in this movie. Whether you blame the script, the directing, the excessive stunt casting, or just the hyperactive, oversaturated 90s aesthetics, the acting is one of those things that can only be enjoyed for its kitschiness.
What causes it? The world causes it. This causes it. This causes it. This causes it. Information overload!
Filming began on February 16, 1994, mostly in and around the Toronto area, in order to take advantage of Canadian tax incentives. There was a lot of friction between the studio and director, because the studio kept pushing for more action, more explosions, and less exposition, and control of the film's tone and style quickly spiraled out of Longo's control. Gibson and Longo had originally imagined the story to be more satirical and tongue-in-cheek, with one of the things they were trying to critique being the kind of action movie the studio wanted Johnny Mnemonic to be. The aforementioned room service speech was written by Gibson as a way to express some of his feelings about how things were going.
I've had it with them! had it with you. I've had it with all this.
8 minutes of extra scenes were filmed specifically for the Japanese release, all of which focused more heavily on Takeshi Kitano's character, and a lot of action sequences were forced into the film by the distributors. After principal photography was complete, and after Speed released to theaters and made Reeves an overnight superstar, the final edit was taken out of Longo's hands, his chosen editor was replaced, and by most reports, the version the studio put together is wildly different from the film Longo and Gibson tried to make. Similarly, the music was also replaced wholesale. The original soundtrack was put together by the industrial band Black Rain, but it was rejected and replaced by a second score by Michael Dana. This second score does show up in the Japanese edit of the film, but it was also rejected by Sony for the international release. So, finally, the Terminator's Brad Fiedel composed a third score that was augmented by a few soundtrack-friendly songs by bands like Orbital and Stabbing Westward. As much as I'd like to criticize the studio for doing this, I must admit I really like the final soundtrack and even owned it on CD back in the day. Following an extensive marketing campaign that included an internet scavenger hunt and TriStar's first use of a tie-in website, Johnny Mnemonic released in April 1995 in Japan and over Memorial Day weekend in the US, where it had the unfortunate honor of competing with the best of the Die Hard sequels. It flopped with critics, who decried it as a pathetic attempt to bring Cyberpunk to the big screen, pointing mostly to the poor acting and plot-hole-ridden script. Audiences didn't flock to it either, and it ultimately only earned a little over $19 million in its domestic run. Even with the international numbers figured in, the movie didn't turn a profit, nor did its tie-in video game. The movie has maintained cult status in the decades since, and Robert Longo was even able to put together his long-dreamed-of black and white version, which released on home video in 2022, though it isn't a director's cut. Personally, I don't understand the appeal, as watching a black and white version has always been possible if you just change the settings on your television screen, and the artistic effect of that change feels hollow when the movie is still the same bombastic 90s action flick it always has been. Not that I have a problem with that. I was an action, sci-fi loving teenager in 1995, and I was already well versed enough in the works of William Gibson to follow along without getting disoriented. I was disappointed by the lack of Molly Millions, but otherwise, I remember thinking it was a fun movie that served as a decent entry point to the cyberpunk universe I knew and loved. As an adult, I can find plenty to criticize. I've already mentioned the terrible acting and the shoehorned edition of Dolph Lundgren, and I can see how a more satirical edit might have been better, or how a lower-budget art movie might have done more justice to Gibson's work. Nevertheless, the movie we got still holds up for me, garish as it is, and feels kind of appropriate in the context of Hollywood coming to terms with the internet age, given that society's understanding of the internet at the time was about as adolescent as Hollywood's understanding of cyberpunk. The point it's trying to make was also prophetic, because digital overload has become all too real in the 21st century, even if it's less a physical nerve virus and more a skibbity toilet brain rot. Johnny is facing the prospect of too much information leaking into his brain and killing him, just as the people around him are falling victim to far too much reliance on digital technology and its corporate sponsors. If that's not a good, rough metaphor for what the world looks like today, I don't know what else is. Therefore, and because I still feel no guilt in taking pleasure in it, Johnny Mnemonic is, and always has been, a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Would you have preferred to see an artsy, black and white take on the source material, or do you like the Hollywood version? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time when we'll cover whatever my Patreon peeps vote for, this is the Unapologetic Geek telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
I want the club sandwich. I want the cold Mexican beer. I want a $10,000 a night hooker.